Chapter 1. There is, as every schoolboy knows in this scientific age, a very close chemical relation between coal and diamonds. It is the reason, I believe, why some people allude to coal as black diamonds. Both these commodities represent wealth, but coal is a much less portable form of property. There is, from that point of view, a deplorable lack of concentration in coal. Now, if a coal mine could be put into one's waistcoat pocket, but it can't. At the same time, there is a fascination in coal, the supreme commodity of the age in which we are camped like bewildered travellers in a garish and restful hotel. And I suppose these two considerations, the practical and the mystical, prevented Axel Haste, from going away. The Tropical Belt Coal Company went into liquidation. The world of finance is a mysterious world in which, incredible as the fact may appear, evaporation precedes liquidation. First, the capital evaporates, and then the company goes into liquidation. These are very unnatural physics, but they account for the persistent inertia of haste, at which we, out there, used to laugh among ourselves, but not inimically. An inert body can do no harm to anyone, provokes no hostility, is scarcely worth derision. It may indeed be in the way sometimes, but this could not be said of Axel Haste. He was out of everybody's way, as if he were perched on the highest peak of the Himalayas, and in a sense as conspicuous. Everyone in that part of the world knew of him, dwelling on his little island. An island is but the top of a mountain. Axel Haste, perched on it immovably, was surrounded, instead of the imponderable stormy and transparent ocean of air merging into infinity, by a tepid, shallow sea, a passionless offshoot of the great waters which embrace the continents of this globe. His most frequent visitors were shadows, the shadows of clouds, relieving the monotony of the inanimate, brooding sunshine of the tropics. His nearest neighbour, I am speaking now of things showing some sort of animation, was an indolent volcano which smoked faintly all day with its head just above the northern horizon, and at night levelled at him, from amongst the clear stars, a dull red glow, expanding and collapsing spasmodically, like the end of a gigantic cigar puffed at intermittently in the dark. Axel Haste was also a smoker, and when he lounged out on his veranda with his cheroot, the last thing before going to bed, he made in the night the same sort of glow and of the same size as that other one so many miles away. In a sense, the volcano was company to him in the shades of the night, which were often too thick, one would think, to let a breath of air through. There was seldom enough wind to blow a feather along. On most evenings of the year, Haste could have sat outside with a naked candle to read one of the books left him by his late father. It was not a mean store, but he never did that. Afraid of mosquitoes, very likely. Neither was he ever tempted by the silence to address any casual remarks to the companion glow of the volcano. He was not mad. Oh, queer chap, yes, that may have been said, and in fact was said. But there is a tremendous difference between the two, you will allow. On the nights of full moon, the silence around Samburan, the round island of the charts, was dazzling, and in the flood of cold light, Haste could see his immediate surroundings, which had the aspect of an abandoned settlement invaded by the jungle. Vague roofs above low vegetation, broken shadows of bamboo fences in the sheen of long grass, something like an overgrown bit of road slanting among ragged thickets towards the shore, only a couple of 100 yards away, with a black jetty and a mound of some sort, quite inky on its unlighted side. But the most conspicuous object was a gigantic blackboard raised on 2 posts and presenting to Haste, when the moon got over that side, the white letters TBC Co. in a row at least 2 feet high. These were the initials of the Tropical Belt Coal Company, his employers. His late employers, to be precise. According to the unnatural mysteries of the financial world, the TBC Company's capital having evaporated in the course of 2 years, the company went into liquidation. Forced, I believe, not voluntary. There was nothing forcible in the process, however. It was slow, and while the liquidation, in London and Amsterdam, pursued its languid course, Axel Haste, styled in the prospectus Manager in the Tropics, remained at his post on Samburan, the number 1 coaling station of the company. And it was not merely a coaling station. There was a coal mine there, with an outcrop in the hillside less than 500 yards from the rickety wharf and the imposing blackboard. The company's object had been to get hold of all the outcrops on tropical islands and exploit them locally. And Lord knows there were any amount of outcrops. It was Haste who had located most of them in this part of the tropical belt during his rather aimless wanderings, and being a ready letter writer had written pages and pages about them to his friends in Europe. At least, so it was said. We doubted whether he had any visions of wealth, for himself at any rate. What he seemed mostly concerned for was the stride forward, as he expressed it, in the general organisation of the universe, apparently. He was heard by more than 100 persons in the island talking of a great stride forward for these regions. The convinced wave of the hand which accompanied the phrase suggested tropical distances being impelled onward. In connection with the finished courtesy of his manner, it was persuasive, or at any rate silencing, for a time at least. Nobody cared to argue with him when he talked in this strain. His earnestness could do no harm to anybody. There was no danger of anyone taking seriously his dream of tropical coal, so what was the use of hurting his feelings? Thus reasoned men in reputable business offices, where he had had his entree as a person who came out east with letters of introduction, and modest letters of credit too, some years before these coal outcrops began to crop up in his playfully courteous talk. From the first there was some difficulty in making him out. He was not a traveller. A traveller arrives and departs, goes on somewhere. Haste did not depart. I met a man once, the manager of the branch of the Oriental Banking Corporation in Malacca, to whom Haste exclaimed in no connection with anything in particular, it was in the billiard room of the club, "I am enchanted with these islands." He shot it out suddenly, apropos des bottes, as the French say, and while chalking his cue. And perhaps it was some sort of enchantment. There are more spells than your commonplace magicians ever dreamt of. Roughly speaking, a circle with a radius of 800 miles drawn round a point in North Borneo was in Haste's case a magic circle. It just touched Manila, and he had been seen there. It just touched Saigon, and he was likewise seen there once. Perhaps these were his attempts to break out. If so, they were failures. The enchantment must have been an unbreakable one. The manager, the man who heard the exclamation, had been so impressed by the tone, fervour, rapture, what you will, or perhaps by the incongruity of it, that he had related the experience to more than one person. "Queer chap, that Swede," was his only comment. But this is the origin of the name Enchanted Haste, which some fellows fastened on our man. He also had other names. In his early years, long before he got so becomingly bald on the top, he went to present a letter of introduction to Mr. Tesman of Tesman Brothers, a Surabaya firm. Tip-top house. Well, Mr. Tesman was a kindly, benevolent old gentleman. He did not know what to make of that caller. After telling him that they wished to render his stay among the islands as pleasant as possible, and that they were ready to assist him in his plans, and so on, and after receiving Haste's thanks, you know the usual kind of conversation, he proceeded to query in a slow, paternal tone, "And you are interested in—" "Facts," broke in Haste in his curtly voice. "There's nothing worth knowing but facts. Hard facts. Facts alone, Mr. Tesman." I don't know if old Tesman agreed with him or not, but he must have spoken about it, because for a time our man got the name of Hard Facts. He had the singular good fortune that his sayings stuck to him and became part of his name. Thereafter he mooned about the Java Sea in some of the Tesman's trading schooners, and then vanished on board an Arab ship in the direction of New Guinea. He remained so long in that outlying part of his enchanted circle that he was nearly forgotten before he swam into view again in a native proa full of Goram vagabonds, burnt black by the sun, very lean, his hair much thinned, and a portfolio of sketches under his arm. He showed these willingly, but was very reserved as to anything else. He had had an amusing time, he said. A man who will go to New Guinea for fun. Well. Later, years afterwards, when the last vestiges of youth had gone off his face, and all the hair off the top of his head, and his red-gold pair of horizontal moustaches had grown to really noble proportions, a certain disreputable white man fastened upon him an epithet. Putting down with a shaking hand a long glass emptied of its contents, paid for by Haste, he said with that deliberate sagacity which no mere water-drinker ever attained, "Haste's a perfect gentleman, perfect. But he's a utopist. Haste had just gone out of the place of public refreshment where this pronouncement was voiced. Utopist, eh? Upon my word, the only thing I heard him say which might have had a bearing on the point was his invitation to old MacNab himself. Turning with that finished courtesy of attitude, movement, voice, which was his obvious characteristic, he had said with delicate playfulness, "Come along and quench your thirst with us, Mr. MacNab." Perhaps that was it. A man who could propose, even playfully, to quench old MacNab's thirst must have been a utopist. A pursuer of chimeras. For of downright irony, Haste was not prodigal. And, maybe, this was the reason why he was generally liked. At that epoch in his life, in the fullness of his physical development, of a broad, martial presence, with his bald head and long moustaches, he resembled the portraits of Charles XII, of adventurous memory. However, there was no reason to think that Haste was in any way a fighting man. Chapter 2. It was about this time that Haste became associated with Morrison, on terms about which people were in doubt. Some said he was a partner, others said he was a sort of paying guest, but the real truth of the matter was more complex. One day Haste turned up in Timor. Why in Timor, of all places in the world, no one knows. Well, he was mooning about Delhi, that highly pestilential place, possibly in search of some undiscovered facts, when he came in the street upon Morrison, who, in his way, was also an enchanted man. When you spoke to Morrison of going home, he was from Dorsetshire, he shuddered. He said it was dark and wet there, that it was like living with your head and shoulders in a moist gunny bag. That was only his exaggerated style of talking. Morrison was one of us. He was owner and master of the Capricorn, trading brig, and was understood to be doing well with her, except for the drawback of too much altruism. He was the dearly beloved friend of a quantity of God-forsaken villages up dark creeks and obscure bays where he traded for produce. He would often sail, through awfully dangerous channels up to some miserable settlement, only to find a very hungry population clamorous for rice, and without so much produce between them as would have filled Morrison's suitcase. Amid general rejoicings, he would land the rice all the same, explain to the people that it was an advance, that they were in debt to him now, would preach to them energy and industry, and make an elaborate note in a pocket diary which he always carried, and this would be the end of that transaction. I don't know if Morrison thought so, but the villagers had no doubt whatsoever about it. Whenever a coast village sighted the brig, it would begin to beat all its gongs and hoist all its streamers, and all its girls would put flowers in their hair, and the crowd would line the river bank. And Morrison would beam and glitter at all this excitement through his single eyeglass with an air of intense gratification. He was tall and lantern-jawed and clean-shaven, and looked like a barrister who'd thrown his wig to the dogs. We used to remonstrate with him. "You'll never see any of your advances if you go on like this, Morrison." He was putting on knowing air. "I shall squeeze them yet some day, never you fear. And that reminds me," pulling out his inseparable pocket-book, "there's that so-and-so village. They're pretty well off again. I may just as well squeeze them to begin with." He would make a ferocious entry in the pocket-book. Memo: squeeze the so-and-so village at the first time of calling. Then he would stick the pencil back and snap the elastic on with inflexible finality. But he never began the squeezing. Some men grumbled at him. He was spoiling the trade. Well, perhaps to a certain extent, but not much. Most of the places he traded with were unknown, not only to geography but also to the trader's special law, which is transmitted by word of mouth, without ostentation, and forms the stock of mysterious local knowledge. It was hinted also that Morrison had a wife in each and every one of them, but the majority of us repulsed these innuendos with indignation. He was a true humanitarian, and rather ascetic than otherwise. When Haste met him in Delhi, Morrison was walking along the street, his eyeglass tossed over his shoulder, his head down, with the hopeless aspect of those hardened tramps one sees on our roads trudging from workhouse to workhouse. Being hailed on the street, he looked up with a wild, worried expression. He really was in trouble. He had come the week before into Delhi, and the Portuguese authorities, on some pretence of irregularity in his papers, had inflicted a fine upon him and had arrested his brig. Morrison never had any spare cash in hand. With his system of trading, it would have been strange if he had. And all these debts entered into the pocket-book weren't good enough to raise a mill-ray on, let alone a shilling. The Portuguese officials begged him not to distress himself. They gave him a week's grace, and then proposed to sell the brig at auction. This meant ruin for Morrison. And when Haste hailed him across the street in his usual courtly tone, the week was nearly out. Haste crossed over and said with a slight bow, and in the manner of a prince addressing another prince on a private occasion, "What an unexpected pleasure! Would you have any objection to drink something with me in that infamous wine shop over there? The sun is really too strong to talk in the street." The haggard Morrison followed obediently into a sombre, cool hovel, which he would have disdained to enter at any other time. He was distracted. He did not know what he was doing. You could have led him over the edge of a precipice just as easily as into that wine shop. He sat down like an automaton. He was speechless, but he saw a glass full of rough red wine before him and emptied it. Haste, meantime, politely watchful, had taken a seat opposite. "You are in for a bout of fever, I fear," he said sympathetically. Poor Morrison's tongue was loosened at that. "Fever!" he cried. "Give me fever! Give me plague! They are diseases. One gets over them. But I am being murdered. I am being murdered by the Portuguese. The gang here downed me at last among them. I am to have my throat cut the day after tomorrow." In the face of this passion, Haste made with his eyebrows a slight motion of surprise which would not have been misplaced in a drawing-room. Morrison's despairing reserve had broken down. He had been wandering with a dry throat all over that miserable town of mud hovels, silent, with no soul to turn to in his distress, and positively maddened by his thoughts. And suddenly he had stumbled on a white man, figuratively and actually white, for Morrison refused to accept the racial whiteness of the Portuguese officials. He let himself go for the mere relief of violent speech, his elbows planted on the table, his eyes bloodshot, his voice nearly gone, the brim of his round pith hat shading an unshaven, livid face. His white clothes, which he had not taken off for 3 days, were dingy. He had already gone to the bad, past redemption. The sight was shocking to Haste, but he let nothing of it appear in his bearing, concealing his impression under that consummate good society manner of his. Polite attention, what's due from one gentleman listening to another, was what he showed, and, as usual, it was catching, so that Morrison pulled himself together and finished his narrative in a conversational tone, with a man-of-the-world air. "It's a villainous plot. Unluckily, one is helpless. That scoundrel Cousinho, Andreas, you know, has been coveting the brig for years. Naturally, I would never sell. She's not only my livelihood, she's my life. So he has hatched this pretty little plot with the chief of the customs. The sale, of course, will be a farce. There's no one here to bid. He will get the brig for a song. No, not even that. The line of a song. You have been some years now in the islands, Haste. You know us all. You've seen how we live. Now you shall have the opportunity to see how some of us end, for it is the end for me. I can't deceive myself any longer. You see it, don't you?" Morrison had pulled himself together, but one felt the snapping strain on his recovered self-possession. Haste was beginning to say that he could very well see all the bearings of this unfortunate, when Morrison interrupted him jerkily. "Upon my word, I don't know why I've been telling you all this. I suppose seeing a thoroughly white man made it impossible to keep my trouble to myself. Words can't do it justice. But since I've told you so much, I may as well tell you more. Listen, this morning on board, in my cabin, I went down on my knees and prayed for help. I went down on my knees." "You are a believer, Morrison?" asked Haste with a distinct note of respect. "Surely I'm not an infidel." Morrison was swiftly reproachful in his answer, and there came a pause, Morrison perhaps interrogating his conscience, and Haste preserving a mien of unperturbed polite interest. "I prayed like a child, of course. I believe in children praying. Well, women too, but I rather think God expects men to be more self-reliant. I don't hold with a man everlastingly bothering the Almighty with his silly troubles. It seems such cheek. Anyhow, this morning I have never done any harm to any God's creature knowingly. I prayed. A sudden impulse. I went flop on my knees. So you may judge." They were gazing earnestly into each other's eyes. Poor Morrison added, as a discouraging afterthought, "Only this is such a God-forsaken spot." Haste inquired with a delicate intonation whether he might know the amount for which the brig was seized. Morrison suppressed an oath, and named curtly a sum which was in itself so insignificant that any other person other than Haste would have exclaimed at it. And even Haste could hardly keep incredulity out of his politely modulated voice as he asked if it was a fact that Morrison had not that amount in hand. Morrison hadn't. He had only a little English gold, a few sovereigns on board. He had left all his spare cash with the Tesmans in Samarang to meet certain bills which would fall due while he was away on his cruise. Anyhow, that money would not have been any more good to him than if it had been in the innermost depths of the infernal regions. He said all this brusquely. He looked with sudden disfavour at that noble forehead, at those great martial moustaches, at the tired eyes of the man sitting opposite him. Who the devil was he? What was he, Morrison, doing there, talking like this? Morrison knew no more of Haste than the rest of us trading in the archipelago did. Had the Swede suddenly risen and hit him on the nose, he could not have been taken more aback than when this stranger, this nondescript wanderer, said with a little bow across the table, "Oh, if that's the case, I would be very happy if you'd allowed me to be of use." Morrison didn't understand. This was one of those things that don't happen, unheard of things. He had no real inkling of what it meant, till Haste said definitely, "I can lend you the amount." "You have the money?" whispered Morrison. Do you mean here, in your pocket?" "Yes, on me. Glad to be of use." Morrison, staring open-mouthed, groped over his shoulder for the cord of the eyeglass hanging down his back. When he found it, he stuck it in his eye hastily. It was as if he expected Haste's usual white suit of the tropics to change into a shining garment, flowing down to his toes, and a pair of great dazzling wings to sprout out on the Swede's shoulders, and didn't want to miss a single detail of the transformation. But if Haste was an angel from on high, sent in answer to prayer, he did not betray his heavenly origin by outward signs. So, instead of going on his knees, as he felt inclined to do, Morrison stretched out his hand, which Haste grasped with formal alacrity and a polite murmur, to which trifle, delighted, of service, could just be distinguished. Miracles do happen, thought the awestruck Morrison. To him, as to all of us in the islands, this wandering Haste, who didn't toil or spin visibly, seemed the very last person to be the agent of Providence in an affair concerned with money. The fact of his turning up in Timor or anywhere else was no more wonderful than the settling of a sparrow on one's windowsill at any given moment. But that he should carry a sum of money in his pocket seemed somehow inconceivable. So inconceivable that, as they were trudging together through the sand of the roadway to the custom house, another mud hovel, to pay the fine, Morrison broke into a cold sweat, stopped short, and exclaimed in faltering accents, I say, you aren't joking, Haste." "Joking?" Haste's blue eyes went hard as he turned them on the discomposed Morrison. "In what way, may I ask?" he continued with austere politeness. Morrison was abashed. "Forgive me, Haste. You must have been sent by God in answer to my prayer. But I've nearly been off my chump for 3 days with worry, and it suddenly struck me. What if it's the devil who's sent him?" "I have no connection with the supernatural," said Haste graciously, moving on. "Nobody has sent me. I just happened along." "I know better," contradicted Morrison. "I may be unworthy, but I have been heard. I know it. I feel it. For why should you offer—" Haste inclined his head, as from respect for a conviction in which he could not share. But he stuck to his point by muttering that in the presence of an odious fact like this, it was natural. Later in the day, the fine paid, and the two of them on board the brig, from which the guard had been removed, Morrison, who, besides being a gentleman, was also an honest fellow, began to talk about repayment. He knew very well his inability to lay by any sum of money. It was partly the fault of circumstances, and partly of his temperament, and it would have been very difficult to apportion the responsibility between the two. Even Morrison himself could not say, while confessing to the fact. With a worried air he ascribed it to fatality. "I don't know how it is that I've never been able to save it. It's some sort of curse. There's always been a bill or two to meet." He plunged his hand into his pocket for the famous notebook so well known in the islands, the fetish of his hopes, and fluttered the pages feverishly. "And yet, look," he went on, "there it is, more than $5,000 owing. Oh, surely that's something." He ceased suddenly. Haste, who had been all the time trying to look as unconcerned as he could, made reassuring noises in his throat. But Morrison was not only honest, he was honourable too. And on this stressful day, before this amazing emissary of Providence, and in the great revulsion of his feelings, he made his great renunciation. He cast off the abiding illusion of his existence. No, they are not good. I'll never be able to squeeze them. Never. I've been saying for years I would, but I give it up. I never really believed I could. Don't reckon on that, Haste. I've robbed you." Poor Morrison actually laid his head on the cabin table and remained in that crushed attitude while Haste talked to him soothingly with the utmost courtesy. The Swede was as much distressed as Morrison, for he understood the other's feelings perfectly. No decent feeling was ever scorned by Haste, but he was incapable of outward cordiality of manner, and he felt acutely his defect. Consummate politeness is not the right tonic for an emotional collapse. They must have had, both of them, a fairly painful time of it in the cabin of the brig. In the end, Morrison, casting desperately for an idea in the blackness of his despondency, hit upon the notion of inviting Haste to travel with him in his brig and have a share in his trading ventures up to the amount of his loan. It is characteristic of Haste's unattached, floating existence that he was in a position to accept this proposal. There is no reason to think that he wanted particularly just then to go poking aboard the brig into all the holes and corners of the archipelago where Morrison picked up most of his trade. Far from it. But he would have consented to almost any arrangement in order to put an end to the harrowing scene in the cabin. There was at once a great transformation act. Morrison raising his diminished head and sticking the glass in his eye to look affectionately at Haste, a bottle being uncorked, and so on. It was agreed that nothing should be said to anyone of this transaction. Morrison, you understand, was not proud of the episode, and he was afraid of being unmercifully chaffed. "An old bird like me, to let myself be trapped by those damned Portuguese rascals. I should never hear the last of it. Oh, we must keep it dark." From quite other motives, among which his native delicacy was the principal, Haste was even more anxious to bind himself to silence. A gentleman would naturally shrink from the part of heavenly messenger that Morrison would force upon him. It made Haste uncomfortable, as it was, and perhaps he did not care that it should be known that he had some means, whatever they might have been, sufficient at any rate to enable him to lend money to people. These two had a duet down there, like conspirators in a comic opera, of "shh, shh, shh, secrecy, secrecy." It must have been funny, because they were very serious about it, and for a time the conspiracy was successful, insofar that we all concluded that Haste was boarding with the good-natured, some said sponging on the imbecile, Morrison in his brig. But you know how it is with all such mysteries. There is always a leak somewhere. Morrison himself, not a perfect vessel by any means, was bursting with gratitude, and under the stress he must have let out something vague, enough to give the island gossip a chance. And you know how kindly the world is in its comments on what it does not understand. A rumour sprang out that Haste, having obtained some mysterious hold on Morrison, had fastened himself onto him and was sucking him dry. Those who had traced these mutters back to their origin were very careful not to believe them. The originator, it seems, was a certain Schomberg, a big, manly, bearded creature of the Teutonic persuasion, with an ungovernable tongue, which surely must have worked on a pivot. Whether he was a lieutenant of the reserve, as he declared, I don't know. Out there he was by profession a hotel keeper, first in Bangkok, then somewhere else, and ultimately in Surabaya. He dragged after him up and down that section of the tropical belt a silent, frightened little woman with long ringlets, who smiled at one stupidly, showing a blue tooth. I don't know why so many of us patronised his various establishment. He was a noxious ass, and he satisfied his lust for silly gossip at the cost of his customers. It was he who, one evening, as Morrison and Haste went past the hotel, they were not his regular patrons, whispered mysteriously to the mixed company assembled on the veranda, "The spider and the fly just gone by, gentlemen." Then, very important and confidential, his thick paw at the side of his mouth. "We are among ourselves. Well, gentlemen, all I can say is, don't you ever get mixed up with that Swede. Don't you ever get caught in his web." Chapter 3. Human nature being what it is, having a silly side to it as well as a mean side, there were not a few who pretended to be indignant on no better authority than the general propensity to believe every evil report, and a good many others who found it simply funny to call Haste the Spider, behind his back, of course. He was as serenely unconscious of this as several other nicknames. But soon people found other things to say of Haste. Not long afterwards he came very much to the fore in larger affairs. He blossomed out into something definite. He filled the public eye as the manager on the spot of the Tropical Belt Coal Company, with offices in London and Amsterdam, and other things about it that sounded and looked grandiose. The offices in the two capitals may have consisted, and probably did, of one room in each, but at that distance, out east there, all this had an air. We were more puzzled than dazzled, it is true, but even the most sober-minded among us began to think that there was something in it. The Tesmans appointed agents, a contract for government mailboats secured, the era of steam beginning for the islands, a great stride forward, Haste's stride. And all this sprang from the meeting of the cornered Morrison and of the wandering Haste, which may or may not have been the direct outcome of a prayer. Morrison was not an imbecile, but he seemed to have got himself into a state of remarkable haziness as to his exact position towards Haste. For if Haste had been sent with money in his pocket by a direct decree of the Almighty in answer to Morrison's prayer, then there was no reason for special gratitude, since obviously he could not help himself. But Morrison believed both in the efficacy of prayer and in the infinite goodness of Haste. He thanked God with awed sincerity for his mercy, and could not thank Haste enough for the services rendered as between man and man. In this highly creditable tangle of strong feelings, Morrison's gratitude insisted on Haste's partnership in the great discovery. Ultimately, we heard that Morrison had gone home through the Suez Canal in order to push the magnificent coal idea personally in London. He parted from his brig and disappeared from our ken. But we heard that he had written a letter or letters to Haste, saying that London was cold and gloomy, that he did not like either the men or things, and that he was as lonely as a crow in a strange country. In truth, he pined after the Capricorn. I don't mean only the tropic, I mean the ship too. Finally, he went into Dorsetshire to see his people, caught a bad cold, and died with extraordinary precipitation in the bosom of his appalled family. Whether his exertions in the city of London had enfeebled his vitality, I don't know, but I believe it was this visit which put life into the coal idea. Be that as it may, the Tropical Belt Coal Company was born very shortly after Morrison, the victim of gratitude in his native climate, had gone to join his forefathers in a Dorsetshire churchyard. Haste was immensely shocked. He got the news in the Moluccas through the Tesmans, and then disappeared for a time. It appears that he stayed with a Dutch government doctor in Amboina, a friend of his who looked after him for a bit in his bungalow. He became visible again rather suddenly, his eyes sunk in his head, and with a sort of guarded attitude, as if afraid someone would reproach him with the death of Morrison. Naive Haste, as if anybody would. Nobody amongst us had any interest in men who went home. They were all right. They did not count any more. Going to Europe was nearly as final as going to heaven. It removed a man from the world of hazard and adventure. As a matter of fact, many of us did not hear of this death until months afterwards, from Schomberg, who disliked Haste gratuitously and made up a piece of sinister whispered gossip. "That's what comes of having anything to do with that fellow. He squeezes you dry like a lemon and chucks you out, sends you home to die. Take warning by Morrison." Of course, we laughed at the innkeeper's suggestions of black mystery. Several of us heard that Haste was prepared to go to Europe himself, to push on his coal enterprise personally, but he never went. It wasn't necessary. The company was formed without him, and his nomination of manager in the tropics came out to him by post. From the first he had selected Samburan, or Round Island, for the central station. Some copies of the prospectus issued in Europe, having found their way out east, were passed from hand to hand. We greatly admired the map which accompanied them for the edification of the shareholders. On it Samburan was represented as the central spot of the Eastern Hemisphere, with its name engraved in enormous capitals. Heavy lines radiated from it in all directions through the tropics, figuring a mysterious and effective star, lines of influence or lines of distance or something of that sort. Company promoters have an imagination of their own. There's no more romantic temperament on earth than the temperament of a company promoter. Engineers came out, coolies were imported, bungalows were put up on Samburan, a gallery driven into the hillside, and actually some coal got out. These manifestations shook the soberest minds. For a time, everybody in the islands was talking of the tropical belt coal, and even those who smiled quietly to themselves were only hiding their uneasiness. Oh yes, it had come, and anybody could see what would be the consequences. The end of the individual trader, smothered under a great invasion of steamers. We could not afford to buy steamers, not we. And Haste was the manager. You know Haste, enchanted Haste. Oh, come, he's been no better than a loafer around here as far back as any of us can remember. Yes, he said he was looking for facts. Well, he's got hold of one that will do for all of us, commented a bitter voice. That's what they call development. And be hanged to it, muttered another. Never was Haste talked about so much in the tropical belt before. Isn't he a Swedish baron or something? He, a baron? Get along with you. For my part, I haven't the slightest doubt that he was. While he was still drifting among the islands, enigmatical and disregarded like an insignificant ghost, he told me so himself on a certain occasion. It was a long time before he materialised in this alarming way into the destroyer of our little industry, Haste the enemy. It became the fashion with a good many to speak of Haste as the enemy. He was very concrete, very visible now. He was rushing all over the archipelago, jumping in and out of local mail packets as if they had been tramcars, here, there and everywhere, organising with all his might. There was no mooning about. This was business. And this sudden display of purposeful energy shook the incredulity of the most sceptical more than any scientific demonstration of the value of these coal outcrops could ever have done. It was impressive. Schomburg was the only one who resisted the infection. Big, manly, in a portly style, and profusely bearded, with a glass of beer in his thick paw, he would approach some table where the topic of the hour was being discussed, would listen for a moment, and then come out with his invariable declaration, "All this is very well, gentlemen, but he can't throw any of his coal dust in my eyes. There's nothing in it." Why, there can't be anything in it. A fellow like that for manager, pooh! Was it the clairvoyance of imbecile hatred, or mere stupid tenacity of opinion, which ends sometimes by scoring against the world in a most astonishing manner? Most of us can remember instances of triumphant folly, and that ass Schomburg triumphed. The TBC company went into liquidation, as I began by telling you. The Tesmans washed their hands of it. The government cancelled those famous contracts, the talk died out, and presently it was remarked here and there that Haste had faded completely away. He had become invisible, as in those early days when he used to make a bolt clear out of sight in his attempts to break away from the enchantment of these isles, either in the direction of New Guinea or in the direction of Saigon, to cannibals or to cafes. The enchanted Haste. Had he at last broken the spell? Had he died? We were too indifferent to wonder over much. You see, we had on the whole liked him well enough, and liking is not sufficient to keep going the interest one takes in a human being. With hatred, apparently it is otherwise. Schomburg couldn't forget Haste. The keen, manly Teutonic creature was a good hater. A fool often is. Good evening, gentlemen. Have you got everything you want? So? Good. You see? What was I always telling you? Aha! There was nothing in it. I knew it. But what I would like to know is what became of that Swede. He put a stress on the word Swede, as if it meant scoundrel. He detested Scandinavians generally. Why? Goodness only knows. A fool like that is unfathomable. He continued, "It's 5 months or more since I have spoken to anybody who has seen him. As I have said, we were not much interested. But Schomburg, of course, could not understand that. He was grotesquely dense. Whenever 3 people came together in his hotel, he took good care that Haste should be with them. "I hope the fellow did not go and drown himself," he would add with a comical earnestness that ought to have made us shudder. Only our crowd was superficial and did not apprehend the psychology of this pious hope. "Why? Haste isn't in debt to you for drinks, is he?" someone asked him once with shallow scorn. "Drinks? Oh dear, no." The innkeeper was not mercenary. Teutonic temperament seldom is. But he put on a sinister expression to tell us that Haste had not paid perhaps 3 visits altogether to his establishment. This was Haste's crime, for which Schomberg wished him nothing less than a long and tormented existence. Observe the Teutonic sense of proportion and nice forgiving temper. At last, one afternoon, Schomberg was seen approaching a group of his customers. He was obviously in high glee. He squared his manly chest with great importance. "Gentlemen, I have news of him." "Who?" "Why, that Swede. He is still on Samburan. He has never been away from it. The company is gone, the engineers are gone, the clerks are gone, the coolies are gone, everything's gone. But there he sticks. Captain Davidson, coming by from the westward, saw him with his own eyes. Something white on the wharf, so he steamed in and went ashore in a small boat. Haste right enough. Put a book into his pocket, always very polite, been strolling on the wharf and reading. 'I remain in possession here,' he told Captain Davidson. 'What I want to know is what he gets to eat there. A piece of dried fish now and then, what? That's coming pretty low for a man who's turned up his nose at my table d'hote.' He winked with immense malice. A bell started ringing, and he led the way to the dining room as if into a temple, very grave, with the air of a benefactor of mankind. His ambition was to feed it at a profitable price, and his delight was to talk of it behind its back. It was very characteristic of him to gloat over the idea of Haste having nothing decent to eat. Chapter 4. A few of us who were sufficiently interested went to Davidson for details. There were not many. He told us that he passed to the north of Samburan on purpose to see what was going on. At first it looked as if that side of the island had been altogether abandoned. This was what he expected. Presently, above the dense mass of vegetation that Samburan presents to view, he saw the head of the flagstaff without a flag. Then, while steaming across the slight indentation, which for a time was known officially as Black Diamond Bay, he made out with his glass the white figure on the coaling wharf. It could be no one but Haste. I thought for certain he wanted to be taken off, so I steamed in. He made no signs. However, I lowered a boat. I could not see another living being anywhere. Yes, he had a book in his hand. He looked exactly as we have always seen him, very neat, white shoes, cork helmet. He explained to me that he had always had a taste for solitude. It was the first I ever heard of it, I told him. He only smiled. What could I say? He isn't the sort of man one can speak familiarly to. There's something in him. One doesn't care to. But what's the object? Are you thinking of keeping possession of the mine? I asked him. Something of the sort, he says. I am keeping hold. But all this is as dead as Julius Caesar, I cried. In fact, you have nothing worth holding on to, Haste. Oh, I am done with facts, said he, putting his hand to his helmet sharply with one of his short bows. Thus dismissed, Davidson went on board his ship, swung her out, and as he was steaming away, he watched from the bridge Haste walking shoreward along the wharf. He marched into the long grass and vanished, all but the top of his white cork helmet, which seemed to swim in a green sea. Then that too disappeared, as if it had sunk into the living depths of the tropical vegetation, which is more jealous of man's conquests than the ocean, and which was about to close over the last vestiges of the liquidated Tropical Belt Coal Company. A. Haste, manager in the East. Davidson, a good, simple fellow in his way, was strangely affected. It is to be noted that he knew very little of Haste. He was one of those whom Haste's finished courtesy of attitude and intonation most strongly disconcerted. He himself was a fellow of fine feeling, I think, though of course he had no more polish than the rest of us. We were naturally a hail fellow well-met crowd, with standards of our own, No worse, I dare say, than other people's, but polish was not one of them. Davidson's fineness was real enough to alter the course of the steamer he commanded. Instead of passing to the south of Samburan, he made it his practice to take the passage along the north shore, within about a mile of the wharf. "He can see us if he likes to see us," remarked Davidson. Then he had an afterthought. "I say, I hope he won't think I'm intruding, eh?" We reassured him on the point of correct behaviour. The sea is open to all. This slight deviation added some 10 miles to Davidson's round trip, but as that was 1,600 miles, it did not matter much. "I've told my owner of it," said the conscientious commander of the Sissy. His owner had a face like an ancient lemon. He was small and wizened, which was strange, because generally a Chinaman, as he grows in prosperity, puts on inches of girth and stature. To serve a Chinese firm is not so bad, and once they become convinced you deal straight by them, their confidence becomes unlimited. You can do no wrong. So Davidson's old Chinaman squeaked hurriedly, "All right, all right, all right, you do what you like, Captain." And there was an end of the matter. Not altogether, though. From time to time the Chinaman used to ask Davidson about the white man. He was still there, eh? "I never see him," Davidson had to confess to his owner, who would peer at him silently through round, horn-rimmed spectacles, several sizes too large for his little face. "I never see him." To me, on occasions he would say, "I haven't a doubt he's there. He hides. It's very unpleasant." Davidson was a little vexed with haste. "Funny thing," he went on, "of all the people I speak to, nobody ever asks after him but that Chinaman of mine. And Schomburg," he added after a while. Yes, Schomburg, of course. He was asking everybody about everything, and arranging the information into the most scandalous shape his imagination could invent. From time to time he would step up, his blinking, cushioned eyes, his thick lips, his very chestnut beard looking full of malice. "Evening, gentlemen. Have you got all you want? So, good. Well, I'm told the jungle has choked the very sheds in Black Diamond Bay. Fact. He's a hermit in the wilderness now. But what can this manager get to eat? It beats me." Sometimes a stranger would inquire with natural curiosity, "Who? What manager?" "Oh, a certain Swede," with a sinister emphasis, as if he were saying, "a certain brigand. Well known here. He's turned hermit from shame. That's what the devil does when he's found out." Hermit. This was the latest of the more or less witty labels applied to Haste during his aimless pilgrimage in this section of the tropical belt, where the inane clacking of Schomburg's tongue vexed our ears. But apparently Haste was not a hermit by temperament. The sight of his land was not invincibly odious to him. We must believe this, since for some reason or other he did come out from his retreat for a while. Perhaps it was only to see whether there were any letters for him at the Tesmans. I don't know. No one knows. But this reappearance shows that his detachment from the world was not complete, and incompleteness of any sort leads to trouble. Axel Haste ought not to have cared for his letters, or whatever it was that brought him out after something more than a year and a half in Samburan, but it was of no use. He had not the hermit's vocation. That was the trouble, it seems. Be this as it may, he suddenly reappeared in the world, broad chest, bald forehead, long moustaches, polite manner and all. The complete Haste, even to the kindly sunken eyes on which there still rested the shadow of Morrison's death. Naturally, it was Davidson who had given him a lift out of his forsaken island. There were no other opportunities, unless some native craft were passing by, a very remote and unsatisfactory chance to wait for. Yes, he came out with Davidson, to whom he volunteered the statement that it was only for a short time, a few days, no more. He meant to go back to Samburan. Davidson expressing his horror and incredulity of such foolishness, Haste explained that when the company came into being, he had his few belongings sent out from Europe. To Davidson, as to any of us, the idea of Haste, the wandering, drifting, unattached Haste, having any belongings of the sort that can furnish a house, was startlingly novel. It was grotesquely fantastic. It was like a bird owning real property. Belongings? Do you mean chairs and tables? Davidson asked with unconcealed astonishment. Haste did mean that. My poor father died in London. It has been all stored there ever since, he explained. For all these years?" exclaimed Davidson, thinking how long we had all known Haste flitting from tree to tree in a wilderness. "Even longer," said Haste, who had understood very well. This seemed to imply that he had been wandering before he came under our observation. In what regions? And what early age? Mystery. Perhaps he was a bird that never had a nest. "I left school early," he remarked once to Davidson on the passage. "It was in England, a very good school. I was not a shining success there." The Confessions of Haste. Not one of us, with the probable exception of Morrison, who was dead, had ever heard so much of his history. It looks as if the experience of hermit life had the power to loosen one's tongue, doesn't it? During that memorable passage in the Sissy, which took about 2 days, he volunteered other hints, for you could not call it information, about his history. And Davidson was interested. He was interested not because the hints were exciting, but because of that innate curiosity about our fellows which is a trait of human nature. Davidson's existence, too, running the Sissy along the Java Sea and back again, was distinctly monotonous, and, in a sense, lonely. He never had any sort of company on board. Native deck passengers in plenty, of course, but never a white man, so the presence of Haste for 2 days must have been a godsend. Davidson was telling us all about it afterwards. Haste said that his father had written a lot of books. He was a philosopher. "Seems to me he must have been something of a crank, too," was Davidson's comment. "Apparently he had quarrelled with his people in Sweden. Just the sort of father you would expect Haste to have." "Isn't he a bit of a crank himself? He told me that directly his father died he lit out onto the wild world on his own, and had been on the move till he fetched up against this famous coal business. Fits the son of the father somehow, don't you think?" For the rest, Haste was as polite as ever. He offered to pay for his passage, but when Davidson refused to hear of it, he seized him heartily by the hand, gave him one of his courtly bows, and declared that he was touched by his friendly proceedings. "I am not alluding to this trifling amount which you declined to take," he went on, giving a shake to Davidson's hand, "but I am touched by your humanity." Another shake. "Believe me, I am profoundly aware of having been an object of it." Final shake of the hand. All this meant that Haste understood in a proper sense the little Sissy's periodic appearance in sight of his hermitage. "He's a genuine gentleman," Davidson said to us. "I was really sorry when he went ashore." We asked him where he had left Haste. "Why, in Surabaya. Where else?" The Tesmans had their principal counting house in Surabaya. There had long existed a connection between Haste and the Tesmans. The incongruity of a hermit having agents did not strike us, nor yet the absurdity of a forgotten cast-off, derelict manager of a wrecked, collapsed, vanished enterprise having business to attend to. We said Surabaya, of course, and took it for granted that he would stay with one of the Tesmans. One of us even wondered what sort of reception he would get, for it was known that Julius Tesman was unreasonably bitter about the Tropical Belt coal fiasco. But Davidson set us right. It was nothing of the kind. Haste went to stay in Schomburg's hotel, going ashore in the hotel launch. Not that Schomburg would think of sending his launch alongside a mere trader like the Sissy, but she had been meeting a coasting mail packet and had been signalled to. Schomburg himself was steering her. You should have seen Schomburg's eyes bulge out when Haste jumped in with an ancient brown leather bag, said Davidson. He pretended not to know who it was, at first anyway. I didn't go ashore with them. We didn't stay more than a couple of hours altogether. Landed 2,000 coconuts and cleared out. I have agreed to pick him up again on my next trip in 20 days' time. Chapter 5. Davidson happened to be 2 days late on his return trip. No great matter, certainly, but he made a point of going ashore at once during the hottest hour of the afternoon to look for Haste. Schomburg's hotel stood back in an extensive enclosure containing a garden, some large trees, and under their spreading boughs a detached hall available for concerts and other performances, as Schomburg worded it in his advertisements. Torn and fluttering bills, intimating in heavy red capitals, "Concerts every night," were stuck on the brick pillars of each side of the gateway. The walk had been long and confoundedly sunny. Davidson stood wiping his wet neck and face on what Schomburg called the piazza. Several doors opened onto it, but all the screens were down. Not a soul was in sight, not even a China boy. Nothing but a lot of painted iron chairs and tables. Solitude, shade, and gloomy silence, and a faint, treacherous breeze which came from under the trees, and quite unexpectedly caused the melting Davidson to shiver slightly, the little shiver of the tropics, which in Surabaya especially often means fever and the hospital to the incautious white man. The prudent Davidson sought shelter in the nearest darkened room. In the artificial dusk, beyond the levels of shrouded billiard tables, a white form heaved up from two chairs on which it had been extended. The middle of the day, table d'hôte tiffin once over, was Schomberg's easy time. He lounged out, portly, deliberate, on the defensive, the great fair beard like a cuirass over his manly chest. He did not like Davidson, never a very faithful client of his. He hit a bell on one of the tables as he went by, and asked in a distinct officer-in-reserve manner, "You desire?" The good Davidson, still sponging his wet neck, declared with simplicity that he had come to fetch away haste, as agreed. "Not here!" A Chinaman appeared in response to the bell. Schomberg turned to him very severely. "Take the gentleman's order." Davidson had to be going. Couldn't wait. Only begged that haste should be informed that the city would leave at midnight. "Not here, I am telling you." Davidson slapped his thigh in concern. Dear me. Hospital, I suppose. A natural enough surmise in a very feverish locality. The lieutenant of the reserve only pursed up his mouth and raised his eyebrows without looking at him. It might have meant anything, but Davidson dismissed the hospital idea with confidence. However, he had to get hold of haste between this and midnight. "He has been staying here?" he asked. "Yes, he was staying here." "Can you tell me where he is now?" Davidson went on placidly. Within himself he was beginning to grow anxious, having developed the affection of a self-appointed protector towards haste. The answer he got was, "Can't tell. It's none of my business," accompanied by majestic oscillations of the hotel keeper's head, hinting at some awful mystery. Davidson was placidity itself. It was his nature. He did not betray his sentiments, which were not favourable to Schomberg. "I'm sure to find out at the Tesman's office," he thought. But it was a very hot hour, and if haste was down at the port, he would have learnt already that the city was in. It was even possible that haste had already gone on board, where he could enjoy a coolness denied to the town. Davidson, being stout, was much preoccupied with coolness and inclined to immobility. He lingered a while, as if irresolute. Schomberg, at the door, looking out, affected perfect indifference. He could not keep it up, though. Suddenly he turned inward and asked with brusque rage, "You wanted to see him?" "Why, yes," said Davidson. "We agreed to meet—" "Don't you bother. He doesn't care about that now." "Doesn't he?" "Well, you can judge for yourself. He isn't here, is he? You take my word for it. Don't you bother about him. I'm advising you as a friend." "Thank you," said Davidson, inwardly startled at the savage tone. "I think I will sit down for a moment and have a drink after all." This was not what Schomberg had expected to hear. He called brutally, "Boy!" The Chinaman approached, and after referring him to the white man by a nod, the hotel keeper departed, muttering to himself. Davidson heard him gnash his teeth as he went. Davidson sat alone with the billiard tables, as if there had not been a soul staying in the hotel. His placidity was so genuine that he was not unduly fretting himself over the absence of haste, or the mysterious manners Schomberg had treated him to. He was considering these things in his own fairly shrewd way. Something had happened, and he was loath to go away to investigate, being restrained by a presentiment that somehow enlightenment would come to him there. A poster of "Concerts every evening," like those on the gate, but in a good state of preservation, hung on the wall fronting him. He looked at it idly, and was struck by the fact, then not so common, that it was a ladies' orchestra. San Giacomo's Eastern Tour, 18 performers. The poster stated that they had had the honour of playing their select repertoire before various colonial excellences, also before pashas, sheikhs, chiefs, His Highness the Sultan of Muscat, etc., etc. Davidson felt sorry for the 18 lady performers. He knew what that sort of life was like. the sordid conditions and brutal incidents of such tours led by such Zangiacomos who often were anything but musicians by profession. While he was staring at the poster, a door somewhere at his back opened, and a woman came in who was looked upon as Schomberg's wife, no doubt with truth. As somebody remarked cynically once, she was too unattractive to be anything else. The opinion that he treated her abominably was based on her frightened expression. Davidson lifted his hat to her. Mrs. Schomberg gave him an inclination of her sallow head, and incontinently sat down behind a sort of raised counter, facing the door, with a mirror and rows of bottles at her back. Her hair was very elaborately done with 2 ringlets on the left side of her scraggy neck. Her dress was of silk, and she had come on duty for the afternoon. For some reason or other, Schomberg exacted this from her, though she added nothing to the fascinations of the place. She sat there in the smoke and noise, like an enthroned idol, smiling stupidly over the billiards from time to time, speaking to no one, and no one speaking to her. Schomberg himself took no more interest in her than may be implied in a sudden and totally unmotived scowl. Otherwise, the very Chinaman ignored her existence. She had interrupted Davidson in his reflections. Being alone with her, her silence and open-eyed immobility made him uncomfortable. He was easily sorry for people. It seemed rude not to take any notice of her. He said, in allusion to the poster, "Are you having these people in the house?" She was so unused to being addressed by customers that at the sound of his voice she jumped in her seat. Davidson was telling us afterwards that she jumped exactly like a figure made of wood, without losing her rigid immobility. She did not even move her eyes, but she answered him freely, though her very lips seemed made of wood. "They stayed here over a month. They're gone now. They played every evening." "Pretty good, were they?" To this she said nothing, and as she kept on staring fixedly in front of her, her silence disconcerted Davidson. It looked as if she had not heard him, which was impossible. Perhaps she drew the line of speech at the expression of opinions. Schomberg might have trained her, for domestic reasons, to keep them to herself. But Davidson felt in honour obliged to converse, so he said, putting his own interpretation on this surprising silence, "I see. Not much account. Such bands hardly ever are. An Italian lot, Mrs. Schomberg, to judge by the name of the boss." She shook her head negatively. "No, he is a German, really, only he dyes his hair and beard black for business. Zangiacomo is his business name." "That's a curious fact," said Davidson. His head being full of haste, it occurred to him that she might be aware of other facts. This was a very amazing discovery to anyone who looked at Mrs. Schomberg. Nobody had ever suspected her of having a mind. I mean, even a little of it. I mean, any at all. One was inclined to think of her as an automaton, a very plain dummy, with an arrangement for bowing the head at times and smiling stupidly now and then. Davidson viewed her profile with a flattened nose, a hollow cheek, and one staring and winking goggle eye. He asked himself, did that speak just now? Would it speak again? It was as exciting for the mere wonder of it as trying to converse with a mechanism. A smile played about the fat features of Davidson, the smile of a man making an amusing experiment. He spoke again to her. "But the other members of that orchestra were real Italians, were they not?" Of course he didn't care. He wanted to see whether the mechanism would work again. It did. It said they were not. They were of all sorts, apparently. It paused, with one goggle eye immovably gazing down the whole length of the room and through the door opening onto the piazza. It paused, then went on in the same low pitch. "There was even one English girl." "Poor devil," said Davidson. "I suppose these women are not much better than slaves, really. Was that fellow with the dyed beard decent in his way?" The mechanism remained silent. The sympathetic soul of Davidson drew its own conclusions. "Beastly life for these women," he said. "When you say an English girl, Mrs. Schomberg, do you really mean a young girl? Some of these orchestra girls are no chicks." "Young enough," came the low voice out of Mrs. Schomberg's unmoved physiognomy. Davidson, encouraged, remarked that he was sorry for her. He was easily sorry for people. Where did they go to from here?" he asked. "She did not go with them. She ran away." This was the pronouncement Davidson obtained next. It introduced a sort of interest. "Well, well," he exclaimed placidly. And then, with the air of a man who knows life, "Who with?" he inquired with assurance. Mrs. Schomburg's immobility gave her an appearance of listening intently. Perhaps she really was listening. But Schomburg must have been finishing his sleep in some distant part of the house. The silence was profound, and lasted long enough to become startling. Then, enthroned above Davidson, she whispered at last, "That friend of yours." "Oh, you know I'm here looking for a friend," said Davidson hopefully. "Won't you tell me—" "I've told you." "Eh?" A mist seemed to roll away from before Davidson's eyes, disclosing something he could not believe. "You can't mean it," he cried. He's not the man for it. But the last words came out in a faint voice. Mrs. Schomburg never moved her head the least bit. Davidson, after the shock which made him sit up, went slack all over. "Haste! Such a perfect gentleman!" he exclaimed weakly. Mrs. Schomburg did not seem to have heard him. This startling fact did not tally somehow with the idea Davidson had of Haste. He never talked of women. He never seemed to think of them, or to remember that they existed. And then, all at once, like this, running off with a casual orchestra girl. "You might have knocked me down with a feather," Davidson told us some time afterwards. By then he was taking an indulgent view of both the parties to that amazing transaction. First of all, on reflection, he was by no means certain that it prevented Haste from being a perfect gentleman, as before. He confronted our open grins or quiet smiles with a serious round face. Haste had taken the girl away to Samburan, and that was no joking matter. The loneliness, the ruins of the spot had impressed Davidson's simple soul. They were incompatible with the frivolous comments of people who had not seen it. That black jetty, sticking out of the jungle into the empty sea, these roof ridges of deserted houses peeping dismally above the long grass, the gigantic and funereal blackboard sign of the Tropical Belt Coal Company, still emerging from a wild growth of bushes like an inscription stuck above a grave, figured by the tall heap of unsold coal at the shore end of the wharf, added to the general desolation. Thus was the sensitive Davidson. The girl must have been miserable indeed to follow such a strange man to such a spot. Haste had, no doubt, told her the truth. He was a gentleman. But no words could do justice to the conditions of life on Samburan. A desert island was nothing to it. Moreover, when you were cast away on a desert island, why, you could not help yourself. But to expect a fiddle-playing girl out of an ambulant ladies' orchestra to remain content there for a day, for one single day, was inconceivable. She would be frightened at the first sight of it. She would scream. A capacity for sympathy in these stout, placid men. Davidson was stirred to the depths, and it was easy to see that it was about Haste that he was concerned. We asked him if he had passed that way lately. "Oh, yes, I always do. About half a mile off." "Seen anybody about?" "No, not a soul, not a shadow." "Did you blow your whistle?" "Blow the whistle? You think I would do such a thing?" He rejected the mere possibility of such an unwarrantable intrusion. Wonderfully delicate fellow, Davidson. "Well, but how do you know that they're there?" he was naturally asked. Haste had entrusted Mrs. Schomburg with a message for Davidson. A few lines in pencil on a scrap of crumpled paper. It was to the effect that an unforeseen necessity was driving him away before the appointed time. He begged Davidson's indulgence for the apparent discourtesy. The woman of the house, meaning Mrs. Schomburg, would give him the facts, though unable to explain them, of course. What was there to explain? Wondered Davidson dubiously. He took a fancy to that fiddle-playing girl, and she to him, apparently, I suggested. Wonderfully quick work, reflected Davidson. What do you think will come of it? Repentance, I should say. But how is it that Mrs. Schomburg has been selected for a confidant? For indeed a waxwork figure would have seemed more useful than that woman whom we all were accustomed to seeing sitting elevated above the 2 billiard tables, without expression, without movement, without voice, without sight. Why, she helped the girl to bolt, said Davidson, turning at me his innocent eyes, rounded by the state of constant amazement in which this affair had left him, like those shocks of terror or sorrow which sometimes leave their victim afflicted by nervous trembling. It looked as though he would never get over it. Mrs. Schomburgk jerked Hast's note, twisted like a pipe-light, into my lap while I sat there unsuspecting, Davidson went on. Directly I had recovered my senses, I asked her what on earth she had to do with it, that Haste should leave it with her. And then, behaving like a painted image rather than a live woman, she whispered, just loud enough for me to hear, I helped them. I got her things together, tied them up in my own shawl, and threw them into the compound out of a back window. I did it. That woman that you would say hadn't the pluck to lift her little finger? Marvelled Davidson in his quiet, slightly panting voice. What do you think of that? I thought she must have had some interest of her own to serve. She was too lifeless to be suspected of impulsive compassion. It was impossible to think that Haste had bribed her. Whatever means he had not the means to do that. Or could it be that she was moved by that disinterested passion for delivering a woman to a man which, in respectable spheres, is called matchmaking? A highly irregular example of it. It must have been a very small bundle, remarked Davidson further. I imagine the girl must have been specially attractive, I said. I don't know. She was miserable. I don't suppose it was more than a little linen and a couple of those white frocks they wear on the platform. Davidson pursued his own train of thought. He supposed that such a thing had never been heard of in the history of the tropics. For where could you find anyone to steal a girl out of an orchestra? No doubt fellows here and there took a fancy to some pretty one, but it was not for running away with her. Oh, dear, no. It needed a lunatic like Haste. Only think what it means, wheezed Davidson, imaginative under his invincible placidity. Just only try to think. Brooding alone on Samburan has upset his brain. He never stopped to consider, or he couldn't have done it. Oh, no sane man. How is a thing like that to go on? What's he going to do with her in the end? It's madness. You say that he's mad. Schomburgk tells us that he must be starving on his island, so he may end yet by eating her, I suggested. Mrs. Schomburgk had no time to enter into details, Davidson told us. Indeed, the wonder was that they had been left alone so long. The drowsy afternoon was slipping by. Footsteps and voices resounded on the veranda. I beg pardon, the piazza. The scraping of chairs, the ping of a smitten bell. Customers were turning up. Mrs. Schomburgk was begging Davidson hurriedly, but without looking at him, to say nothing to anyone, when on a half-uttered word her nervous whisper was cut short. Through a small inner door Schomburgk came in, his hair brushed, his beard combed neatly, but his eyelids still heavy from his nap. He looked with suspicion at Davidson, glanced at his wife, but he was baffled by the natural placidity of the one and the acquired habit of immobility in the other. "Have you sent out the drinks?" he asked surlily. She did not open her lips, because just then the head boy appeared with a loaded tray on his way out. Schomburgk went to the door and greeted the customers outside, but did not join them. He remained blocking half the doorway, with his back to the room, and was still there when Davidson, after sitting still for a while, rose to go. At the noise he made, Schomburgk turned his head, watched him lift his hat to Mrs. Schomburgk and receive her wooden bow accompanied by a stupid grin, and then looked away. He was loftily dignified. Davidson stopped at the door, deep in his simplicity. "I'm sorry you won't tell me anything about my friend's absence," he said. "My friend Haste, you know. I suppose the only course for me now is to make inquiries down at the port. I shall hear something there, I don't doubt." "Make inquiries of the devil," replied Schomburgk in a hoarse mutter. Davidson's purpose in addressing the hotel keeper had been mainly to make Mrs. Schomburgk safe from suspicion, but he would fain have heard something more of Haste's exploit from another point of view. It was a shrewd try. It was successful in a rather startling way, because the hotel keeper's point of view was horribly abusive. All of a sudden, in the same hoarse, sinister tone, he proceeded to call Haste many names, of which Schweinhund was not the worst, with such vehemence that he actually choked himself. Profiting from the pause, Davidson, whose temperament could withstand worse shocks, remonstrated in an undertone. "It's unreasonable to get so angry as that. Even if he had run off with your cash box." The big hotel keeper bent down and put his infuriated face close to Davidson's. "My cash box? He... Look here, Captain Davidson. He ran off with a girl. What do I care for the girl? The girl is nothing to me." He shot out an infamous word which made Davidson start. That's what the girl was, and he reiterated the assertion that she was nothing to him. What he was concerned for was the good name of his house. Wherever he had been established, he had always had artist parties staying in his house. One recommended him to the others. But what would happen now when it got about that the leaders ran the risk in his house, of losing members of their troupe? And just now, when he had spent 734 guilders in building a concert hall in his compound. Was that a thing to do in a respectable hotel? The cheek, the indecency, the impudence, the atrocity. Vagabond, impostor, swindler, ruffian, Schweinhund. He had seized Davidson by a button of his coat, detaining him in the doorway, and exactly in the line of Mrs. Schomburg's stony gaze. Davidson stole a glance in that direction, and thought of making some sort of reassuring sign to her, but she looked so bereft of senses, and almost of life, perched up there, that it seemed not worth while. He disengaged his button with firm placidity. Thereupon, with a last stifled curse, Schomburg vanished somewhere within to try and compose his spirits in solitude. Davidson stepped out on the veranda. The party of customers there had become aware of the explosive interlude in the doorway. Davidson knew one of these men, and nodded to him in passing, but his acquaintance called out, "Isn't he in a filthy temper?" "He's been like that ever since." The speaker laughed aloud, while all the others sat smiling. Davidson stopped. Yes, rather. His feelings were, he told us, those of bewildered resignation, but of course that was no more visible to the others than the emotions of a turtle when it withdraws into its shell. "It seems unreasonable," he murmured thoughtfully. "Oh, but they had a scrap," the other said. "What do you mean? Was there a fight?" "A fight with Haste?" asked Davidson, much perturbed, if somewhat incredulous. "Haste? No, these two, the bandmaster, the fellow who's taking these women about, and our Schomburg. Signor Zangiacomo ran amuck in the morning, and went for our most worthy friend. I tell you, they were rolling around on the floor together in this very veranda, after chasing each other all over the house. Doors slamming, women screaming, 17 of them, in the dining room. Chinamen up the trees. Hey, John, you'll climb tree to see the fight, eh?" The boy, almond-eyed and impassive, emitted a scornful grunt, finished wiping the table, and withdrew. "Oh, that's what it was, a real go-as-you-please scrap. And Zangiacomo began it. Oh, here's Schomburg. Say, Schomburg, didn't he fly at you when the girl was missed, because it was you who insisted that the artist should go about the audience during the interval?" Schomburg had reappeared in the doorway. He advanced. His bearing was stately, but his nostrils were extraordinarily expanded, and he controlled his voice with apparent effort. "Certainly. That was only business. I quoted him special terms, and all for your sake, gentlemen. I was thinking of my regular customers. There's nothing to do in the evenings in this town. I think, gentlemen, you are all pleased at the opportunity of hearing a little good music. And where's the harm of offering a grenadine or what-not to a lady artist? But that fellow, that Swede, he got round the girl. He got round all the people out here. I've been watching him for years. You remember how he got round Morrison?" He changed front abruptly, as if on parade, and marched off. The customers at the table exchanged glances silently. Davidson's attitude was that of a spectator. Schomburg's moody pacing of the billiard-room could be heard on the veranda. "And the funniest part is," resumed the man who had been speaking before, an English clerk in a Dutch hat, "the funniest part is that before 9 o'clock that same morning these two were driving together in a gharry down to the port to look for Haste and the girl. I saw them rushing around making inquiries. I don't know what they would have done to the girl, but they seemed quite ready to fall upon your Haste, Davidson, and kill him on the quay." He had never, he said, seen anything so queer. Those two investigators, working feverishly to the same end, were glaring at each other with surprising ferocity. In hatred and mistrust they entered a steam launch and went flying from ship to ship all over the harbour, causing no end of sensation. The captains of vessels, coming on shore later in the day, brought tales of a strange invasion, and wanted to know who were the two offensive lunatics in a steam launch, apparently after a man and a girl, and telling a story of which one could make neither head nor tail. Their reception by the roadstead was generally unsympathetic, even to the point of the mate of an American ship bundling them out over the rail with unseemly precipitation. Meanwhile, Haste and the girl were a good few miles away, having gone in the night on board one of the Tasman schooners bound to the eastward. This was known afterwards from the Javanese boatman whom Haste hired for the purpose at 3 o'clock in the morning. The Tasman schooner had sailed at daylight with the usual land breeze, and was probably still in sight of the offing at the time. However, the two pursuers, after their experience with the American mate, made for the shore. On landing, they had another violent row in the German language, but there was no second fight, and finally, with looks of fierce animosity, they got together into a gharry, obviously with the frugal view of sharing expenses, and drove away, leaving an astonished little crowd of Europeans and natives on the quay. After hearing this wondrous tale, Davidson went away from the hotel veranda, which was filling with Schomburg's regular customers. Haste's escapade was the general topic of conversation. Never before had that unaccountable individual been the cause of so much gossip, he judged. No, not even in the beginnings of the Tropical Belt Coal Company, when becoming for a moment a public character, was he the object of a silly criticism and unintelligent envy for every vagabond and adventurer in the islands. Davidson concluded that people liked to discuss that sort of scandal better than any other. I asked him if he believed that this was such a great scandal after all. Heavens, no, said that excellent man, who himself was incapable of any impropriety of conduct. But it isn't a thing I would have done myself. I mean, even if I had not been married. There was no implied condemnation in the statement, rather something like regret. Davidson shared my suspicion that this was, in its essence, the rescue of a distressed human being. Not that we were two romantics, tinging the world to the hue of our temperament, but that both of us had been acute enough to discover a long time ago that Haste was. I shouldn't have had the pluck, he continued. I see a thing all round, as it were, but Haste doesn't, or else he would have been scared. You don't take a woman into a desert jungle without being made sorry for it sooner or later, in one way or another, and Haste being a gentleman only makes it worse.